The Eternal Fire, Understanding Heraclitus, and the Philosophy of Constant Change. In this video, we'll break down one of the greatest Roman philosophers. From constantly changing his ideas through his belief that everything flows and no man ever steps into the same river twice, to believing that opposites are essentials parts of a harmonious society. This is Heraclitus, born around 535 BCE into one of the most prominent families in this wealthy Greek city. He would become known as the Dark Philosopher. But beneath this dramatic title lies one of the most profound and revolutionary thinkers in human history. A man who saw what others missed, who understood that the universe speaks to us constantly if only we know how to listen. Heraclitus was born into privilege and power. His family held hereditary rights to important religious offices in Ephesus, and he could have lived a comfortable life of political influence and social prestige. But something in his nature rejected this conventional path. According to ancient accounts, he gave up his hereditary privileges to his brother and withdrew from public life, choosing instead the difficult work of genuine philosophical inquiry. He spent his time observing, thinking, and recording his insights in prose so dense and cryptic that even ancient readers complained about its difficulty. Why did Heraclitus write in riddles and paradoxes? Some ancient critics accused him of deliberate obscurity, of trying to seem profound by being incomprehensible, but this misunderstands his entire project. Heraclitus believed that truth cannot be handed over like a commodity from one person to another. Truth must be discovered through personal effort, through wrestling with difficult ideas, through learning to see what is hidden beneath the surface of things. His cryptic style was not designed to hide truth, but to force readers to think for themselves, to become active participants in philosophical discovery, rather than passive recipients of someone else's conclusions. The world into which Heraclitus was born was one of tremendous intellectual ferment. The Ionian Greeks had recently begun what we now call philosophy, the systematic attempt to understand the nature of reality through reason, rather than through mythology. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes had proposed that the universe could be understood as emerging from a single fundamental substance, water, the boundless, or air. But Heraclitus saw something these earlier thinkers had missed. They were looking for stability, for permanent substances that underlie all change. He realized that change itself might be the fundamental reality. What makes Heraclitus unique among ancient philosophers is his willingness to embrace contradiction and paradox as features of reality rather than as problems to be solved. Where other thinkers sought unity and permanence beneath the apparent chaos of experience, Heraclitus saw that conflict and change were not illusions to be explained away, but the very fabric of existence. He understood that the universe operates through tension between opposites, that stability emerges from dynamic balance rather than from static permanence. This was not mystical obscurantism, but profound insight into how complex systems actually function. His philosophy speaks to us across 25 centuries because he addressed questions that remain urgently relevant. How do we live in a world of constant change? How do we find meaning when everything is temporary? How do we understand ourselves when even our own identities are constantly transforming? How do we make sense of a universe that seems to contain both order and chaos, both pattern and unpredictability? These are not abstract academic questions, but practical challenges that every human being faces every day. Through his fragments, written in some of the most beautiful and enigmatic prose in ancient Greek, Heraclitus created a philosophy that remains as challenging and illuminating today as it was in the 6th century BCE. He saw the universe as an eternal fire, constantly transforming yet somehow remaining coherent. He understood human beings as participants in cosmic processes far larger than individual consciousness. He recognized that wisdom comes not from accumulating information, but from learning to perceive the hidden patterns that structure reality. His ideas remain as relevant today as they were 2,500 years ago, perhaps even more so in our age of rapid change, digital transformation, and fundamental uncertainty about the future. Part 1. Everything flows. The most famous saying attributed to Heraclitus is one that he probably never spoke in exactly this form, but which captures the essence of his philosophy perfectly. You cannot step into the same river twice. This simple observation about a river contains within it an entire worldview, a revolutionary understanding of what it means for anything to exist at all. To grasp what Heraclitus meant requires us to think carefully about something we usually take for granted: the nature of things and how they persist through time. When you look at a river, what are you actually seeing? Your immediate answer might be a body of water flowing between banks toward the sea. But Heraclitus invites you to look more carefully. The water you see in front of you at this moment is not the same water that was there a moment ago. That water has flowed downstream and new water has taken its place. The river is not a thing but a process, not a static object but a dynamic pattern of flow. Every molecule of water in the river is constantly being replaced, yet we still call it the same river. The identity of the river consists not in any particular water, but in the continuity of the pattern, the ongoing process of flow itself. Now, extend this insight beyond rivers to everything else. Your own body is like a river. The cells that compose your tissues are constantly dying and being replaced. The atoms that make up those cells are constantly being exchanged with your environment through breathing, eating, and excretion. Physically speaking, very little of the matter that composed your body 7 years ago is still part of your body today. Yet you consider yourself the same person. Your identity, like the river's identity, consists not in any particular matter, but in the continuity of pattern and process. Consider a flame. What is a flame? It appears to be a thing, a luminous object that maintains its shape and colour. But a flame is not an object at all. It is a process of combustion, a continuous chemical reaction in which fuel is transformed into heat and light. The specific molecules involved in the flame are constantly changing as fuel is consumed and gases are produced, yet the flame persists as a recognizable phenomenon. The flame is not the matter involved in combustion, but the pattern of transformation itself. Heraclitus saw that this principle applies universally. Everything that exists is more like a river or a flame than like a stone or a brick. Even things that seem stable and permanent are actually processes of continuous change that maintain their identity through pattern rather than through the persistence of any particular matter. A mountain is constantly weathering and eroding, constantly exchanging molecules with the atmosphere and the groundwater. It persists as a mountain not because it is unchanging, but because the processes of erosion and geological transformation occur slowly enough that the overall pattern remains recognizable. This insight has profound implications for how we understand reality. The world is not made of things that occasionally change. The world is made of processes of change that sometimes produce stable patterns. Change is not something that happens to things. Change is what things are. Existence and transformation are not separate but identical. To exist is to change, and to stop changing is to cease to exist. But Heraclitus went further than simply observing that everything changes. He also recognized that the changes we observe are not random or chaotic, but follow patterns that can be understood. The river flows according to the contours of the landscape and the principles of fluid dynamics. The flame burns according to the chemistry of combustion. Your body changes according to biological processes that follow regular patterns. The universe is not just change, but ordered change. Not just flux, but patterned flux. This ordered change, Heraclitus called the Logos. This Greek word is notoriously difficult to translate because it carries multiple meanings simultaneously. It can mean word, speech, reason, proportion, ratio, pattern, or principle. For Heraclitus, the Logos is the rational structure that governs all change, the universal pattern that makes the cosmos, an ordered whole rather than a chaos. The Logos is what makes it possible for the river to remain a river, despite constant change in its waters. It is what allows your body to maintain its organization, despite constant replacement of its constituent parts. It is the reason that patterns repeat and processes follow regular courses. The Logos is not a thing, and it is not a god in the conventional sense. It is more like what we might call the laws of nature, except that Heraclitus would not separate these laws from the things that obey them. The Logos is not imposed on the universe from outside, but is inherent in the processes that constitute the universe. Fire burns according to its nature, water flows according to its nature, and living things grow and reproduce according to their natures. The Logos is the sum total of these inherent patterns and principles. Understanding the Logos is what distinguishes wisdom from mere knowledge. Most people, Heraclitus complained, live as if they have private understanding, as if each person's experience constituted its own separate reality. They fail to recognize the common patterns that structure everyone's experience. They are like sleepers who inhabit their own private dream worlds rather than waking individuals who share a common world. True wisdom consists in recognizing the Logos, in learning to perceive the universal patterns that govern all change and connect all things. But the Logos cannot be grasped through casual observation or conventional thinking. It requires a different kind of attention, a willingness to look beneath the surface of things and to think in ways that initially seem paradoxical or contradictory. Heraclitus's teaching style reflects this requirement. He does not present systematic arguments that lead from premises to conclusions. Instead, he offers brief, enigmatic statements that force readers to think for themselves, to puzzle over apparent contradictions until they achieve genuine insight. Consider another famous fragment: the way up and the way down are the same. On the surface, this seems obviously false. If you are climbing a mountain, the way up is not the same as the way down. You follow the same path, but in opposite directions. But Heraclitus is not talking about physical direction. He is pointing to something deeper about the nature of processes and relationships. Every process contains its opposite within itself. What goes up must come down. Growth contains within it the seeds of decay. Life contains death, and death contains the possibility of new life. Opposites are not separate things, but poles of a single continuum, aspects of a unified process. This insight pervades Heraclitus's entire philosophy. Opposites exist only in relation to each other and transform into each other continuously. Day and night are not separate phenomena, but phases of a single cycle. Hot and cold are not distinct states, but positions on a continuum of temperature. Health and disease are not absolute opposites, but aspects of a dynamic equilibrium that is constantly shifting. The living and the dead are phases of a single process of transformation. Heraclitus expressed this insight in one of his most striking fragments. Immortal mortals, mortal immortals, living the other's death, dying the other's life. This cryptic statement points to the fundamental interdependence and mutual transformation of apparent opposites. What seems to be immortal achieves that status only through the constant death and renewal of its mortal components. What seems to be alive is simultaneously dying. The boundary between life and death, between persistence and change, is not a sharp division, but a zone of continuous transformation. Part 2. The Unity of Opposites. Heraclitus's doctrine of the unity of opposites is perhaps his most distinctive and important contribution to philosophy. It represents a radical break from common-sense understanding of how things relate to each other, and it remains deeply counterintuitive even when we understand it intellectually. Yet it offers profound insights into the nature of reality and how complex systems maintain themselves through time. Common sense tells us that opposites exclude each other. Something cannot be both hot and cold, both moving and stationary, both one and many. If something is one thing, it cannot simultaneously be its opposite. Aristotle would later formalize this intuition as the law of non-contradiction, which states that something cannot both be and not be in the same respect at the same time. This principle has seemed so obviously true to most philosophers that they have treated it as the foundation of all rational thought. But Heraclitus saw something that common sense misses. Opposites do not simply exclude each other, but depend on each other for their very existence and continuously transform into each other. Without cold, there could be no hot, because hot and cold are not absolute properties, but relative positions on a continuum. Something is hot only in comparison to something cooler, and cold only in comparison to something warmer. The concepts of hot and cold are meaningless, except in relation to each other. More profoundly, things that seem opposite are often the same thing observed from different perspectives or at different points in a cyclical process. Seawater, Heraclitus observed, is both pure and impure, drinkable for fish, but poisonous for humans. The same substance has opposite properties depending on the nature of the creature considering it. The road from Athens to Thebes and the road from Thebes to Athens are the same road. The direction of travel determines whether we call it one thing or its opposite. Heraclitus illustrated this principle through numerous examples drawn from everyday experience. The barley drink, he noted, separates if it is not stirred. This simple observation contains deep insight. The unified drink depends on constant motion and mixing. Stability and identity emerge from dynamic process rather than from static permanence. Stop stirring, and the drink separates into its components, revealing that its apparent unity was actually a product of ongoing activity. He applied this insight to understanding conflict and harmony. "War is the father of all and king of all," he wrote, shocking his readers with this apparent celebration of conflict. But Heraclitus was not glorifying violence or arguing that conflict is good. He was pointing to something more subtle, that harmony arises from the tension between opposing forces rather than from the absence of opposition. The harmony of the lyre and the bow depends on the tension between string and frame. If the opposing forces are perfectly balanced, you get stable structure. If they are unbalanced, you get transformation and change. This applies to everything from physical structures to social institutions to individual psychology. A building stands because the force of gravity pulling it down is balanced by the structural forces holding it up. Remove either force, and the building ceases to be a building. A society maintains stability through the balanced tension between different groups and interests. Eliminate the tension and you get stagnation or dissolution, not harmony. An individual achieves psychological health through balancing competing drives and desires, not through eliminating some in favor of others. The unity of opposites also explains how identity persists through change. You are the same person you were yesterday, despite having changed in countless ways, because your identity consists not in any particular state, but in the continuity of the process of transformation. The river is the same river despite constant change in its waters, because its identity consists in the ongoing pattern of flow. The flame is the same flame despite constant transformation of the matter involved in combustion, because its identity consists in the process of burning itself. This insight has profound implications for ethics and how we should live. If opposites are unified and interdependent, then we cannot simply seek to eliminate what we consider bad or negative. Pain and pleasure, struggle and ease, failure and success are not separate conditions, but aspects of a unified life. The goal is not to achieve permanent pleasure or perfect ease, but to find the right balance and rhythm in the oscillation between opposites. Heraclitus expressed this with characteristic pungency. Physicians who cut and burn and torture patients in every way complain that they do not receive adequate pay from the patients, though they achieve these same results as the diseases. The physician and the disease are performing the same actions, causing pain and damage to the body. The difference lies in the purpose and the ultimate result. The physician's cuts heal while the disease's damage destroys, but both involve temporary harm in service of a larger pattern. The unity of opposites also reveals the limitations of language and conventional thought. Our language is built on the assumption that things are what they are and not something else, that opposites exclude each other, that identity is stable and determinate. But reality, Heraclitus suggests, is more fluid and paradoxical than our language can easily express. This is why he writes in riddles and paradoxes. He is trying to point beyond the limitations of ordinary language to a way of understanding that grasps contradiction as a feature of reality, rather than as a sign of confused thinking. Consider one of his most enigmatic fragments. The name of the bow is life, but its work is death. The Greek word for bow is bios, which sounds identical to the Greek word for life, bios. Heraclitus is playing with this homophony to make a philosophical point. The tool whose name suggests life actually deals death. What seems opposite are united in a single object that embodies both life and death, creation and destruction. The archer depends on the bow for survival, for obtaining food, for defending against enemies. Yet the bow's function is to kill. Life requires death. The opposites interpenetrate at every level. Another fragment makes a similar point more directly. Gods and humans, living and dead, awake and sleeping, young and old are all the same, for the latter change into the former, and the former into the latter. The boundary between these supposed opposites is permeable and temporary. What is alive will die. What is dead will be transformed into new life as its matter is recycled into new organisms. What is awake will sleep, and what sleeps will wake. What is young will age, and what is old was once young. The opposites are phases in cyclical processes, not permanent separate categories. This way of thinking is deeply alien to the Western philosophical tradition that developed after Heraclitus. Aristotelian logic, which dominated Western thought for 2 millennia, insists on the law of non-contradiction as fundamental. Either something is X or it is not X. There is no middle ground. This either-or thinking has proven immensely powerful for certain purposes, particularly for mathematics and formal logic. But it may also blind us to aspects of reality that Heraclitus perceived more clearly. Eastern philosophical traditions, particularly Taoism and Buddhism, have preserved ways of thinking more compatible with Heraclitus's insights. The Taoist concept of yin and yang, opposing forces that contain each other and transform into each other, closely parallels Heraclitus's unity of opposites. Buddhist teachings about impermanence and dependent origination echo his insights about constant change and the interdependence of all things. It is striking that thinkers in different cultures arriving at similar insights about the fundamental nature of reality. Modern physics has also vindicated some of Heraclitus's intuitions. Quantum mechanics reveals that matter and energy are not separate, but transform into each other according to Einstein's famous equation. Particle physics shows that what seem like solid, stable particles are actually temporary patterns in quantum fields. Thermodynamics demonstrates that order and disorder are not opposites, but exist on a continuum, with local decreases in entropy always accompanied by greater increases elsewhere. Complex systems theory studies how stable patterns emerge from the dynamic interaction of multiple components. In each case, modern science is rediscovering insights that Heraclitus articulated 2,500 years ago. Part 3. Fire as the fundamental element. While earlier Ionian philosophers sought to identify a single fundamental substance from which everything else derives, Heraclitus made a characteristically paradoxical choice. He identified fire as the basic element, but fire is not really a substance at all. Fire is pure process, pure transformation. You cannot hold fire or bottle it or preserve it. Fire exists only in the act of burning, only as matter transforms from one state to another. By choosing fire as fundamental, Heraclitus was saying that process and change are more basic than any static substance. This cosmic fire is not ordinary flame, though ordinary flame reveals something about the nature of reality. Heraclitus speaks of an ever-living fire, kindling in measures and being quenched in measures. The universe itself is a vast process of transformation, analogous to combustion. Some things are always being consumed, transformed into other forms, while simultaneously other forms are being generated from what was consumed. The total amount remains constant, even though everything is constantly changing form. Heraclitus describes how this cosmic fire transforms through various stages. Sea is liquefied earth, and earth is liquefied sea. In the other direction, fire condenses to become air, air condenses to become water, and water condenses to become earth. Then the process reverses. Earth evaporates to become water, water evaporates to become air, and air ignites to become fire again. The universe is a vast circulation in which the basic element transforms through various states in endless cycles. This anticipates in remarkable ways the modern understanding of matter and energy. We now know that matter can be converted into energy, and energy into matter. We understand that the different states of matter, solid, liquid, and gas, represent different configurations of the same underlying substance. We recognize that the universe undergoes constant transformation at every scale, from the subatomic to the cosmic. Heraclitus grasped these insights intuitively long before science could demonstrate them empirically. The image of cosmic fire also captures something essential about how energy flows through systems. Fire spreads from fuel source to fuel source, transforming matter into heat and light as it goes. Similarly, the sun's energy enters the biosphere through photosynthesis, is stored in plant matter, is consumed by animals, and is eventually dissipated as heat. Energy is constantly flowing and transforming, never created or destroyed, but constantly changing form. Life itself is a special case of this general pattern, a temporary local reversal of entropy made possible by the larger flow of energy through the system. Heraclitus understood that the fire transforms according to patterns and principles, not randomly. Different materials burn in characteristic ways. The same fuel under the same conditions produces the same kind of flame. The cosmic fire likewise transforms according to the Logos, following regular patterns that make the world intelligible. This is why there is a cosmos at all, rather than mere chaos. The fundamental process of transformation is governed by rational principles that can be understood by human intelligence. But Heraclitus also recognized that this cosmic fire has no beginning and no end. Unlike the creation myths of his culture, which described gods making the world at some point in the distant past, Heraclitus insisted that the cosmos was not made by any god or human, but always was, and is, and will be an ever-living fire. This eternal fire makes the universe fundamentally dynamic rather than static, fundamentally a process rather than a thing, fundamentally temporal rather than eternal in the sense of being outside time. This raises a profound question that has occupied philosophers ever since. If everything is constantly changing, what accounts for the stability and order we observe? Why doesn't the world simply dissolve into chaos? Heraclitus' answer is that stability emerges from the balanced exchange of opposites. Just as a flame maintains its shape and character, despite constant transformation of the matter involved, the cosmos maintains its order despite constant flux, because the processes of transformation are balanced and reciprocal. He illustrated this with the image of exchange. All things are an exchange for fire, and fire for all things, as goods for gold, and gold for goods. Fire is constantly being exchanged for other forms and other forms for fire, but the total exchange balances out so that the overall system remains stable. This is not static stability, but dynamic equilibrium, like a waterfall that maintains its shape despite constant flow of water through it, or like a living organism that maintains its structure despite constant metabolism and cell replacement. The fire also represents the principle of transformation that makes life and consciousness possible. Living things are characterized by their ability to take in matter and energy from their environment, transform it through metabolism, and use it to maintain and reproduce their structure. This is analogous to fire consuming fuel and converting it to heat and light. Life is a kind of controlled combustion, a way of temporarily channeling the universal process of transformation to serve the purposes of individual organisms. Heraclitus saw human consciousness as participating in the cosmic fire in an especially intimate way. "The dry soul is wisest and best," he wrote, suggesting that the soul itself has a fiery nature. A dry soul burns brightly with intelligence and awareness, while a wet soul, one sodden with drink or excessive emotion, flickers weakly. The metaphor captures something important about the relationship between consciousness and energy. Thinking is a high-energy process. The brain consumes a disproportionate share of the body's metabolic energy. Consciousness requires intensity and focus, qualities analogous to a strong flame. This fiery nature of consciousness also explains why awareness is always active and never merely passive. Just as fire must constantly consume fuel to exist, consciousness must constantly engage with experience to maintain itself. The mind that does not think, like the fire without fuel, simply goes out. This insight anticipates modern neuroscience's understanding that consciousness depends on high levels of neural activity and breaks down when that activity falls below certain thresholds. The cosmic fire also provides Heraclitus with a solution to the problem of how unity and multiplicity relate. The universe is both one and many simultaneously. It is one because everything is ultimately fire transforming through various states. It is many because at any given moment fire exists in countless different forms. The one and the many are not contradictory but complementary ways of describing the same reality from different perspectives. This resolves a puzzle that troubled ancient philosophy. If everything is really just one thing, how can there be genuine multiplicity and difference? If there are genuinely many different things, how can the universe constitute a unified whole? Heraclitus' answer is that unity and multiplicity are not static conditions, but dynamic relationships. The universe is one in the sense that all transformations participate in a single cosmic process. It is many in the sense that this process manifests in countless different forms at any given moment. Unity does not exclude multiplicity, but generates it through differentiation, while multiplicity does not exclude unity but presupposes it as the medium of transformation. Part 4. The Logos and Universal Reason. The concept of logos is central to Heraclitus's philosophy, yet it remains difficult to pin down precisely what he meant by this term. The logos is at once the rational structure of the universe, the principle that governs all change, the pattern that makes reality intelligible, and the truth that philosophy seeks to articulate. Understanding the logos is what distinguishes wisdom from ignorance, and failure to understand it is the root of human foolishness and confusion. Heraclitus began one of his works with a striking claim. Although this logos is always the case, people are uncomprehending both before they hear it and when they first hear it. For although all things happen according to this logos, people are like those with no experience even when they experience such words and deeds as I set out, distinguishing each thing according to its nature and explaining how it is. Other people fail to notice what they do when awake, just as they forget what they do when asleep. This passage reveals several important aspects of the logos. First, it is always present and always operative. Everything that happens according to the logos. This is not some hidden truth that only initiates can access, but the public structure of reality itself. Second, most people fail to recognize the logos even though they constantly experience its operation. They live as if asleep, going through the motions of life without genuine understanding of the patterns that govern their experience. Third, understanding the logos requires active effort and careful attention to how things actually work, not passive reception of information. The logos is common, meaning both that it is shared by all and that it should be obvious to anyone who thinks carefully. Yet most people live as if they have their own private understanding, interpreting everything according to their individual prejudices and limited perspectives. They fail to recognize that there is a universal rationality that structures everyone's experience and makes communication possible in the first place. Heraclitus used the analogy of language to illuminate this point. When people speak, they use words according to common conventions of meaning. If everyone used words according to purely private definitions, communication would be impossible. The possibility of language depends on shared meanings, on a common understanding that transcends individual differences. Similarly, the possibility of knowledge depends on a common rational structure to reality that makes objective truth possible. The logos is to reality what grammar and meaning are to language, the public structure that makes intelligibility possible. But understanding the logos requires a different kind of thinking than most people practice. Conventional thinking works by categorizing things into stable types and applying general rules. Heraclitean thinking requires recognizing patterns of transformation, grasping how opposites unite and transform into each other, seeing the whole in the parts and the parts in the whole. It requires learning to think in terms of processes and relationships rather than substances and properties. Heraclitus expressed this with characteristic obscurity. Listening not to me but to the logos, it is wise to agree that all things are one. He is not asking people to trust his personal authority, but to recognize the truth that he articulates. The message is more important than the messenger, and the message is that beneath apparent multiplicity and diversity lies a fundamental unity, but a unity that includes and generates diversity, rather than excluding it. This unity is not the abstract unity of a single substance or a single principle. It is the concrete unity of a cosmos in which everything is connected to everything else through relations of transformation and exchange. Fire becomes water, becomes earth, becomes fire again. Life feeds on death, and death makes new life possible. Up and down are the same path travelled in different directions. The logos is the pattern of these transformations and exchanges, the rational structure that makes the cosmos an intelligible whole, rather than a meaningless chaos. Understanding the logos also reveals the limitations of conventional morality and conventional wisdom. People treat good and bad, just and unjust, beautiful and ugly as absolute opposites. But from the perspective of the logos, these opposites are unified and interdependent. What is good for one creature is bad for another. What seems just from one perspective seems unjust from another. What appears beautiful in one context appears ugly in another. This does not mean that morality is arbitrary or that all judgments are equally valid. It means that moral wisdom requires understanding context, grasping relationships, recognizing that simple rules cannot capture the complexity of actual situations. Heraclitus illustrated this with vivid examples. Donkeys would prefer garbage to gold. What humans value means nothing to creatures with different needs and natures. The most beautiful ape is ugly compared to the human species. The wisest human appears as an ape compared to the divine. Value and excellence are relative to context and perspective, not absolute properties that things possess independently of any observer. Yet this recognition of relativity does not lead to nihilism or skepticism. The logos itself is not relative but absolute. It is the universal pattern that governs all transformations and makes all perspectives possible. Understanding the logos means understanding how different perspectives relate to each other, how they emerge from and refer back to a common reality. It means achieving a kind of cosmic perspective that transcends individual limitations while acknowledging their inevitability. The logos also explains why human beings have such difficulty agreeing about fundamental questions. We each experience reality from our own limited perspective, shaped by our particular bodies, our particular cultures, our particular histories. These differences are not merely obstacles to knowledge, but constitute the conditions under which knowledge is possible at all. A view from nowhere would not be knowledge, but mere abstraction. Real knowledge requires a particular perspective while also recognizing its limitations and connections to other perspectives. Heraclitus compared people who fail to understand the logos to sleepers inhabiting private dream worlds. When awake, we share a common world, but in sleep, each person retreats into their own private universe. Most people, he suggests, live as if asleep even when their eyes are open. They interpret everything according to their own narrow concerns, without recognizing the larger patterns that connect their experience to that of others. They mistake their private opinions for objective truth and their limited perspectives for complete understanding. Waking up to the logos requires what Heraclitus calls learning about one's own soul. The boundaries of the soul you would not find even travelling every path, so deep is its logos. The soul itself participates in the cosmic logos, has its own rational structure that connects to universal patterns. To understand reality, we must understand ourselves. And to understand ourselves, we must understand how we participate in reality. Self-knowledge and cosmic knowledge are not separate but intertwined. This anticipates the famous Socratic injunction to know thyself, but with a characteristic Heraclitean twist. Self-knowledge is not knowledge of some stable, unchanging essence, but knowledge of one's participation in cosmic processes of transformation. The soul itself is not a static thing, but a dynamic pattern that connects individual consciousness to universal patterns of change. To know oneself is to know how one's own transformations reflect and participate in cosmic transformations. Part 5. Strife and Harmony. One of Heraclitus's most controversial and misunderstood doctrines is his claim that war is the father of all things, and strife is justice. This has sometimes been interpreted as glorifying violence and conflict, as advocating a philosophy of might makes right, or as revealing a pessimistic view of human nature and social life. But such interpretations miss the depth and subtlety of what Heraclitus actually meant. When Heraclitus speaks of war and strife, he is not primarily referring to military conflict or physical violence. He is describing the fundamental structure of a reality in which opposites perpetually struggle against each other, each trying to assert itself against its contrary, neither ever achieving complete victory. This cosmic strife is not destructive but creative. It is what generates the endless variety and complexity of existence. Without opposition and tension, there would be no dynamic balance, no stable structures, no life or consciousness. Consider again the example of the bow and the lyre. Both instruments depend on the tension between string and frame. If the string is slack, the instrument does not work. If the string is too tight, it breaks. The right tension, the right degree of opposition between pulling forces, produces both stability and function. The instrument can shoot an arrow or produce music because opposing forces are held in balanced tension. Remove the opposition, and you destroy the instrument. Heraclitus saw this principle operating everywhere in nature and human life. Living organisms maintain themselves through the constant tension between anabolic and catabolic processes, between building up and breaking down. Remove either process, and the organism dies. Societies maintain themselves through the tension between different classes and interests. A society without internal differences and conflicts would be static and lifeless. Individual psychology depends on balanced tension between different drives and impulses. The psychologically healthy person is not someone without internal conflict, but someone who manages that conflict productively. The statement that war is the father of all things can be understood as saying that differentiation and individuation emerge from conflict and opposition. In the beginning, if we can speak of such a thing, there is undifferentiated unity. Distinct things emerge only through a process of separation and opposition. Fire separates from what it burns. Living things separate from their environment. Consciousness separates from its objects. Each separation creates a new polarity, a new pair of opposites in tension with each other. This original separation and opposition is what makes multiplicity and diversity possible. Moreover, Heraclitus recognized that strife creates justice by ensuring that no single force or power achieves absolute dominance. If one opposite completely overwhelmed its contrary, the result would be stasis and death, rather than dynamic balance and life. The ongoing struggle between opposites ensures that neither pole can permanently triumph, that the oscillation between extremes continues, that transformation and change remain possible. From this perspective, strife is not the opposite of justice, but its precondition. This insight has profound implications for ethics and politics. It suggests that perfect harmony and the elimination of all conflict is neither possible nor desirable. A certain amount of tension, disagreement, and struggle is essential for health at both individual and social levels. The goal should not be to eliminate conflict, but to manage it in ways that remain productive rather than destructive, that generate creativity and growth rather than violence and suffering. Heraclitus expressed this with characteristic pungency. People do not understand how that which is at variance with itself agrees with itself. It is a back-turning connection like that of the bow and the lyre. The bow and lyre both curve away from themselves, creating tension and potential energy. This back-turning, this self-opposition, is what makes them functional. Similarly, things that seem opposed and at variance actually constitute a higher unity precisely through their opposition. This doctrine of creative strife influenced later philosophers in various ways. Plato's theory of forms can be seen as an attempt to escape from Heraclitean flux into a realm of eternal, unchanging truth. Aristotle's concept of potentiality and actuality represents a sophisticated attempt to reconcile being and becoming, stability and change. Hegel's dialectical method, in which thesis and antithesis generate synthesis, is a direct descendant of Heraclitean thought. Nietzsche's philosophy of will to power and his celebration of conflict and struggle are deeply indebted to Heraclitus. But Heraclitus also recognized limits to creative strife. Not all conflict is equally productive. Some forms of opposition generate new possibilities while others simply destroy. The key difference lies in whether the conflict maintains dynamic balance or whether one side achieves dominance. War between human communities can be creative when it forces both sides to adapt and innovate, but destructive when one side simply annihilates the other. Psychological conflict can be productive when it leads to growth and integration, but destructive when it leads to neurosis or psychosis. The measure, the right proportion, is what distinguishes creative from destructive strife. Fire that burns in measure maintains itself and provides light and heat. Fire that burns without measure consumes everything and destroys itself. Conflict that maintains balance preserves the opposites and allows their ongoing interaction. Conflict that destroys balance eliminates one pole and thereby eliminates the creative tension altogether. This connects to Heraclitus's famous statement that the thunderbolt steers all things. The thunderbolt represents sudden decisive intervention that restores balance when things have gotten too far out of kilter. Lightning strikes when electrical potential between clouds and ground becomes too great. The strike discharges the accumulated tension and restores equilibrium. Similarly, in natural and social systems, accumulated imbalances eventually trigger dramatic events that reset the system to a more sustainable state. Heraclitus saw wisdom as consisting largely in understanding how to maintain the right measure, how to balance opposing forces without letting either achieve dominance. This requires constant vigilance and ongoing adjustment. It cannot be reduced to simple rules because every situation is unique and requires its own specific balance. The wise person develops a feel for proportion and measure, a sensitivity to when things are getting out of balance and what interventions might restore equilibrium. This understanding of creative strife also illuminates Heraclitus's famous obscurity. His paradoxical statements and apparent contradictions are not signs of confused thinking, but attempts to jar readers out of conventional modes of thought. By presenting opposites as unified, by asserting that war is justice and strife is creative, he forces us to think in new ways, to recognize patterns we had not seen before. The difficulty of his teaching is not accidental, but essential to its purpose. Part 6. The problem of knowledge. If everything is constantly changing and opposites are constantly transforming into each other, how is knowledge possible? This question troubled ancient philosophers and led many of them to reject or modify Heraclitus's doctrines. Plato argued that knowledge requires unchanging objects, and therefore must concern eternal forms rather than the changing world of experience. But this response misunderstands what Heraclitus was claiming. He was not saying that knowledge is impossible, but that it requires a different understanding of what knowledge is and how it works. Knowledge, for Heraclitus, is not a matter of grasping eternal, unchanging truths, but of understanding patterns of transformation. The river changes constantly, but its pattern of flow remains intelligible. We can understand how rivers work, even though no river ever stays the same from one moment to the next. Similarly, we can understand how fire burns, how living things grow and reproduce, how human beings think and act, even though all these processes involve constant change. Knowledge concerns patterns and principles rather than static states. This requires a different approach to inquiry than Plato's search for eternal essences. We must observe carefully how things actually change, noting what patterns repeat and what principles govern transformations. We must recognize that things often become their opposites, that stability emerges from dynamic balance, that identity consists in continuity of pattern rather than persistence of substance. We must learn to think in terms of processes and relationships rather than things and properties. Heraclitus emphasized the importance of direct observation and personal experience. Learning about many things does not teach understanding, he wrote. If it did, it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras and Xenophanes and Hecataeus. He was criticizing these earlier thinkers not for being ignorant, but for accumulating information without genuine understanding. They knew many facts, but failed to grasp the patterns that connect those facts into meaningful wholes. They were learned, but not wise. True wisdom, Heraclitus suggested, comes not from accumulating information, but from learning to perceive the logos, the universal pattern that structures all change. This requires a kind of attentiveness that goes beyond mere observation. We must learn to see through appearances to underlying patterns, to recognize the same principles operating in different contexts, to grasp how particular instances exemplify universal regularities. This is more like developing a skill than like learning facts. It requires practice, sustained effort, and gradual refinement of perception. Heraclitus also recognized that human senses have severe limitations. Eyes and ears are poor witnesses for people who have barbarian souls. Our senses provide raw data, but we need intelligence to interpret that data correctly. People with crude or undeveloped intelligence misinterpret their sensory experience, seeing only surfaces without grasping the patterns beneath. Developing understanding requires cultivating the soul's capacity to recognize patterns and connections that are not immediately obvious to unreflective observation. Moreover, the very effort to articulate truth in language faces fundamental obstacles. Language works by fixing meanings and creating stable categories. But if reality is constantly changing and opposites are constantly transforming into each other, ordinary language will inevitably distort what it tries to express. This is why Heraclitus writes in paradoxes and riddles. He is trying to point beyond the limitations of ordinary language to truths that can only be grasped through a different kind of thinking. This does not mean that truth is arbitrary or subjective. The logos is objective and universal. But expressing the logos in language requires special techniques that prevent readers from falling back into conventional modes of thought. The paradoxes force active engagement. The riddles require sustained reflection. The obscurity is designed to make understanding difficult enough that readers who achieve it genuinely transform their way of thinking, rather than simply adding new information to their existing frameworks. Heraclitus was particularly critical of people who trust in poets and popular opinion as teachers. Most people treat Homer and Hesiod as authorities on fundamental questions about gods and human life. But these poets simply repeat conventional opinions dressed up in memorable verses. They perpetuate common illusions rather than challenging them. Real wisdom requires breaking free from received opinion and learning to think independently based on careful observation of how things actually work. This emphasis on independent thinking and resistance to authority made Heraclitus profoundly anti-democratic in his political views. The many are bad, and only few are good, he asserted. The best people choose one thing above all others, eternal glory among mortals, while the majority are stuffed like cattle. Democracy empowers the ignorant masses who fail to understand the logos and follow their immediate appetites rather than genuine wisdom. This elitism sits uncomfortably with modern democratic values, but it reflects Heraclitus's conviction that genuine understanding is rare and cannot be achieved through majority opinion. Yet Heraclitus's epistemology also contains surprisingly democratic elements. The logos is common and available to everyone who makes the effort to understand it. The patterns that structure reality are public and can be observed by anyone with sufficient attentiveness. Wisdom does not depend on special revelation or esoteric initiations, but on careful observation and clear thinking. In principle, anyone can achieve understanding. In practice, most people fail to make the necessary effort. Knowledge also requires self-knowledge in a way that anticipates Socratic philosophy. "I went searching for myself," Heraclitus wrote. Understanding reality requires understanding how we participate in it, how our own processes of perception and thought reflect and embody universal patterns. The soul itself has its own logos that connects it to cosmic patterns. To understand the world, we must understand how we are shaped by and contribute to the processes we observe. This creates a kind of circle or feedback loop in the process of coming to knowledge. We observe the world through our own particular perspective, shaped by our bodies, cultures, and personal histories. But by understanding how our perspectives are shaped, we can begin to compensate for their limitations and distortions. We can recognize our biases and blind spots and work to overcome them. We can learn to see from multiple perspectives and grasp how they relate to each other. Knowledge requires both engagement with external reality and critical reflection on our own processes of knowing. Part 7. Human Nature and the Soul. Heraclitus's understanding of human nature follows directly from his general metaphysics. If everything is fire transforming through various states, if reality is constant change governed by rational patterns, if opposites unite and transform into each other, then human beings cannot be exceptions to these principles. We too are processes of transformation, patterns of flow maintained through constant exchange with our environment, participants in cosmic patterns rather than separate substances existing independently. The soul, for Heraclitus, is not an immaterial substance that inhabits the body temporarily and survives its death. The soul is more like a flame, a process that maintains its identity through constant transformation of its material substrate. A dry soul is wisest and best, while a wet soul, one sodden with drink or excessive emotion, burns weakly and produces less light and heat. The metaphor captures something essential about consciousness. Clear thinking requires energy and intensity. It is an active process that consumes resources and produces illumination. This fiery nature of the soul has several important implications. First, the soul is not passive, but fundamentally active. Consciousness is not a mirror that simply reflects external reality, but an active process of engagement and transformation. Second, the quality of consciousness depends on maintaining the right condition, the right kind of fuel, the right intensity of burning. Third, the soul is connected to the cosmic fire, participates in the same fundamental process that structures all reality. Heraclitus also suggested that the soul has depth that cannot be fully plumbed. The boundaries of the soul you would not find even travelling every path. So deep is its logos. This is not saying that the soul is infinite or bottomless, but that understanding consciousness requires understanding how it participates in patterns that extend far beyond individual awareness. The soul's logos connects it to cosmic logos. Self-knowledge therefore requires understanding universal patterns, not just introspecting on private mental states. Death, in this framework, is not the departure of an immortal soul from a mortal body, but a transformation of the pattern that constitutes individual consciousness. The specific configuration of fire that constitutes your consciousness will disperse, and its components will be incorporated into other patterns. The matter and energy that compose you will continue to exist and transform, but the particular pattern that makes you, you will dissolve. Death is real and final for the individual, but it is also a natural phase in cosmic processes of transformation. This understanding of death has important ethical implications. If death ends individual consciousness permanently, then this life is all we have. There is no afterlife to compensate for present suffering, no divine justice to vindicate the righteous and punish the wicked. Whatever meaning and value life has must be found in living itself, not in some future state that transcends the human condition. This anticipates existentialist themes about authenticity and responsibility while grounding them in a naturalistic metaphysics. Heraclitus recognized that most people live without genuine understanding of their own nature and condition. They sleepwalk through life, reacting to circumstances without grasping the patterns that shape their experience. They pursue immediate pleasures and avoid immediate pains, without understanding what truly contributes to human flourishing. They adopt conventional opinions without critical examination and mistake social customs for natural necessities. Living well requires waking up to the Logos, both cosmic and personal. This waking up is not something that happens once and for all, but requires constant effort. The soul, like fire, must constantly be fed or it goes out. Consciousness requires ongoing engagement with experience, continuous learning, perpetual questioning. The moment we stop actively attending and thinking, we fall back into the sleep of convention and habit. Wisdom is not a possession that once achieved can be taken for granted, but a practice that must be constantly renewed. Heraclitus also recognized the social dimensions of human existence. We are shaped by our communities, our languages, our cultures. These social contexts provide the frameworks within which we develop as individuals, but they also impose limitations and distortions. Conventional wisdom often mistakes local customs for universal truths, temporary arrangements for permanent necessities. Breaking free from these limitations requires recognizing their contingency and learning to think independently. Yet complete independence from social contexts is neither possible nor desirable. The Logos is common, meaning both universal and shared. Understanding requires language and concepts that are necessarily social products. The isolated individual, cut off from all social influence, would not achieve pure objectivity, but would simply be imprisoned in their own limited perspective. Genuine wisdom requires both critical independence and recognition of inescapable social embeddedness. Human emotions also reflect cosmic patterns of transformation and the unity of opposites. Joy and sorrow are not separate states, but poles of a continuum along which consciousness moves. The capacity for joy requires the capacity for sorrow. Someone incapable of deep grief is also incapable of deep happiness. The opposites define each other and transform into each other as circumstances change. This does not mean that all emotional states are equally valuable, but it does mean that emotional health requires the ability to experience the full range rather than trying to eliminate certain emotions entirely. Desire and satisfaction illustrate the same pattern. Desire creates tension and dissatisfaction, but satisfaction is possible only because of prior desire. The pleasure of eating requires prior hunger. The joy of companionship requires prior loneliness. The satisfaction of achievement requires prior struggle and uncertainty. Trying to achieve permanent satisfaction by eliminating desire would be like trying to achieve permanent day by eliminating night. It fundamentally misunderstands how these apparent opposites actually relate. Heraclitus's understanding of human nature is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. Human beings have the capacity for wisdom and virtue, but most people fail to realize these capacities. We can understand the Logos and live according to it, but doing so requires sustained effort against the current of conventional thinking and habitual behavior. We are neither essentially good nor essentially evil, but essentially capable of both, essentially free to choose how we engage with the conditions we face. Yet complete independence from social contexts is neither possible nor desirable. The Logos is common, meaning both universal and shared. Understanding requires language and concepts that are necessarily social products. The isolated individual, cut off from all social influence, would not achieve pure objectivity, but would simply be imprisoned in their own limited perspective. Genuine wisdom requires both critical independence and recognition of inescapable social embeddedness. Human emotions also reflect cosmic patterns of transformation and the unity of opposites. Joy and sorrow are not separate states, but poles of a continuum along which consciousness moves. The capacity for joy requires the capacity for sorrow. Someone incapable of deep grief is also incapable of deep happiness. The opposites define each other and transform into each other as circumstances change. This does not mean that all emotional states are equally valuable, but it does mean that emotional health requires the ability to experience the full range rather than trying to eliminate certain emotions entirely. Desire and satisfaction illustrate the same pattern. Desire creates tension and dissatisfaction, but satisfaction is possible only because of prior desire. The pleasure of eating requires prior hunger. The joy of companionship requires prior loneliness. The satisfaction of achievement requires prior struggle and uncertainty. Trying to achieve permanent satisfaction by eliminating desire would be like trying to achieve permanent day by eliminating night. It fundamentally misunderstands how these apparent opposites actually relate. Heraclitus's understanding of human nature is neither optimistic nor pessimistic, but realistic. Human beings have the capacity for wisdom and virtue, but most people fail to realize these capacities. We can understand the Logos and live according to it, but doing so requires sustained effort against the current of conventional thinking and habitual behavior. We are neither essentially good nor essentially evil, but essentially capable of both, essentially free to choose how we engage with the conditions we face. Part 8. Ethics and the Good Life. Heraclitus's ethics emerges organically from his metaphysics and epistemology. If reality is constant transformation governed by rational patterns, if wisdom consists in understanding these patterns, and if human flourishing depends on living in accordance with the Logos, then ethics becomes a matter of aligning individual life with cosmic patterns. This is not ethics based on divine commands, social conventions, or abstract principles, but ethics based on understanding how things actually work and how human beings actually flourish. The fundamental ethical principle is to follow the common, meaning both to follow the Logos that structures reality and to recognize one's connection to the community of rational beings. Most people live according to private understanding, interpreting everything according to their own limited perspectives and immediate interests. They fail to recognize the universal patterns that should guide action and the common good that transcends individual advantage. Wisdom requires seeing beyond private concerns to universal principles. This does not mean sacrificing individual interests for collective welfare in the conventional sense. The common that we should follow is not majority opinion or social convention, but the rational structure of reality itself. Following the Logos may require going against social conventions when those conventions conflict with genuine understanding. It may require asserting individual judgment against popular opinion. The ethics of following the common is not conformity, but alignment with truth. Heraclitus emphasized that human excellence requires constant effort and struggle. The best people choose one thing above all else, eternal glory among mortals, while the majority are glutted like cattle. Achieving genuine virtue and wisdom requires choosing difficulty over ease, genuine excellence over comfortable mediocrity, lasting reputation over immediate pleasure. This is inherently elitist, but the elite Heraclitus describes is defined by choice and effort rather than by birth or wealth. The good life requires maintaining proper measure and balance. Too much of anything, even good things, becomes bad. Too little, even of apparently bad things, creates problems. The wise person understands how to balance opposing forces and find the right proportion for specific situations. This cannot be reduced to simple rules because every situation is unique. It requires practical wisdom, a developed sense for what specific circumstances require. Heraclitus illustrated this with vivid examples. Seawater is both pure and impure, drinkable and healthy for fish, undrinkable and deadly for humans. What constitutes benefit or harm depends on context and perspective. There are no absolute goods that benefit everyone equally in all circumstances. Wisdom requires understanding how goods are relative to natures and situations, while also recognizing universal patterns that constrain what can count as good for beings like us. Pleasure and pain likewise must be understood in their proper relationship. They are not absolute opposites, one to be maximized and the other minimized, but unified poles of a spectrum along which experience oscillates. The capacity for pleasure requires the capacity for pain. More profoundly, much genuine human flourishing requires activities that involve both pleasure and pain mixed together. The athlete must endure pain to achieve excellence. The artist must struggle through frustration to create beauty. The philosopher must wrestle with difficult ideas to achieve understanding. Trying to eliminate all pain would eliminate much of what makes life meaningful and valuable. Human relationships likewise reflect patterns of unity and opposition. We are drawn to others by affinity and similarity, but we also need difference and distance. Relationships that are too close and intense become suffocating. Relationships that are too distant and formal lack genuine intimacy. The healthy relationship maintains tension between togetherness and autonomy, between similarity and difference, between stability and growth. This requires ongoing adjustment and cannot be achieved once and for all. Justice in Heraclitus's framework is not a matter of following conventional rules or divine commands, but of maintaining proper balance and proportion. Strife is justice, because ongoing struggle between opposing forces prevents any single power from achieving absolute dominance. Justice in human affairs requires institutions and practices that balance competing interests and prevent permanent domination of some by others. This is why Heraclitus, despite his elitism, did not advocate for simple rule by the wise. Even the wise require checks on their power. Heraclitus recognized the importance of law and custom, but saw them as subordinate to genuine understanding. One law must be enough for a city to obey the will of one wise person who knows the Logos. But finding such a person is rare, and even the wise can be corrupted by power. Laws and customs serve as imperfect attempts to embody wisdom in institutional form. They should be respected when they align with genuine understanding, but can be challenged when they conflict with the Logos. The ethics that emerges from Heraclitus's philosophy is demanding but not impossible, elitist but not arbitrary, naturalistic but not reductive. It requires constant effort to understand how things actually work and constant attention to maintaining proper balance and proportion. It demands that we think independently rather than following convention blindly. It insists that we align individual action with universal patterns rather than pursuing purely private interests. It offers no easy answers or comfortable certainties, but provides principles for living well in a world of constant change. The good life for Heraclitus is the life lived in accordance with the Logos, the life that understands and participates consciously in cosmic patterns of transformation. This is not a life of passive acceptance or quiet resignation, but a life of active engagement and creative response. It requires courage to face difficult truths, discipline to maintain focus and effort, wisdom to discern right proportion, and humility to recognize our limitations. It offers no ultimate salvation or perfect happiness, but provides genuine satisfaction available to beings like us in circumstances like ours. Part 9. Death and Transformation. Death occupies a unique position in Heraclitus's philosophy. It is neither the ultimate evil to be avoided at all costs, nor a transition to some better state of existence. Death is a transformation, one phase in the cosmic cycle of change that structures all existence. Understanding death properly requires understanding its place in these larger patterns, rather than treating it as an isolated catastrophe that befalls individuals. Heraclitus addressed death with characteristic paradox: immortal mortals, mortal immortals, living the other's death, dying the other's life. What does this enigmatic statement mean? It points to the fundamental interpenetration of life and death, the way each contains and depends on the other. What we call immortal, the gods or the cosmos itself, achieves its continuity only through the constant death and renewal of mortal individuals. What we call mortal, individual living beings, participates in immortal patterns and processes that transcend any particular life. Moreover, life and death are not sharply separated, but exist on a continuum of transformation. Living things are constantly dying in the sense that their cells are constantly breaking down and being replaced. Death begins before what we conventionally call death. Conversely, death is not complete annihilation, but transformation into other forms. The matter and energy that composed a living being continue to exist and participate in new configurations. Death gives rise to new life in an endless cycle. This understanding of death as transformation, rather than as absolute ending, has important implications for how we should face mortality. If death is natural and necessary, a phase in cosmic processes that make existence possible, then it should not be regarded with horror or treated as the ultimate enemy. This does not mean that individual death is trivial, or that we should not mourn the loss of particular people we love, but it does mean that death should be accepted as part of the pattern, rather than raged against as an intrusion or injustice. Heraclitus suggested that death might even be welcome or beneficial in certain circumstances. For souls, it is death to become water. For water, it is death to become earth. But from earth, water is born, and from water, soul. The cycle of transformation means that death is also birth. What dies in one form is born in another. This is not personal immortality or reincarnation, but something more fundamental. The very substance of existence is constantly dying and being reborn in new configurations. This connects to Heraclitus's understanding of time and change. If everything is constantly transforming, then the boundary between life and death becomes permeable and ambiguous. At what point does a living organism become a dead body? The transition is gradual rather than instantaneous. Processes that characterize life, metabolism, and responsiveness and organization gradually wind down rather than suddenly ceasing. Death is not a moment, but a process, another transformation in the endless flow. Human consciousness of death creates unique challenges and possibilities. Unlike other animals, humans know that they will die. This knowledge shapes how we live, creating urgency and meaning that would not exist if we were immortal. The fact that life is limited and temporary makes each moment precious. If we had infinite time, nothing would matter very much. Because time is finite, our choices have weight and significance. Heraclitus recognized this without drawing explicit conclusions, but his philosophy implies a particular stance toward mortality. If death is natural and inevitable, if it is part of the cosmic pattern rather than a punishment or accident, then wisdom requires accepting it without excessive fear or desperate attempts to avoid it. The wise person lives fully in the time available without being paralyzed by fear of death or wasting life in futile attempts to achieve immortality. This stance is neither resignation nor defiance, but acceptance of necessity combined with determination to live well within limitations. It parallels the attitude Camus would later advocate toward the absurd, but it is grounded in a naturalistic metaphysics rather than in existential rebellion. For Heraclitus, accepting death is not resignation to meaninglessness, but recognition of one's place in meaningful patterns that transcend individual existence. The understanding of death as transformation also has implications for how we should mourn and remember the dead. If death is not absolute ending but transformation, then the dead are not simply gone but have become something else. Their matter returns to the earth and eventually to new life. Their influence continues through the effects they had on others. Their patterns of thought and action may be preserved in cultural memory. In these senses, the dead continue to participate in the life of the world even though their individual consciousness has ended. Heraclitus himself seems to have desired recognition and remembrance as forms of immortality. The best people choose eternal glory among mortals rather than immediate pleasure. This suggests that while individual consciousness ends with death, something of the person can persist through reputation and influence. Not immortality in the conventional sense, but a kind of continued participation in human affairs through the memories and actions of those who come after. This is a modest form of immortality compared to the promises of religious traditions, but it may be more realistic and more attainable. We cannot know whether consciousness survives bodily death, but we can know that our actions influence others and that our ideas can outlive our biological existence. This kind of immortality through influence and memory is available to anyone who contributes something valuable to human life. Part 10. The Hidden Harmony. One of Heraclitus's most profound insights concerns the relationship between surface appearance and underlying reality. Nature loves to hide, he wrote. The true character of things is not obvious to casual observation, but requires sustained attention and careful thought to perceive. This hidden character is what he called the invisible harmony, which he claimed is stronger than the visible. What did Heraclitus mean by this invisible harmony? He was pointing to the fact that the patterns and principles that structure reality are not themselves visible or tangible. We see rivers flowing, but not the principles of fluid dynamics that govern their flow. We observe living things growing and reproducing, but not the biological processes that make these activities possible. We experience our own consciousness, but not the neural activity that produces it. The most important and powerful aspects of reality are precisely those that remain hidden from direct perception. This hidden harmony is stronger than visible harmony because it is more fundamental and more enduring. The visible forms that we observe are temporary manifestations of underlying patterns. The patterns themselves persist even as particular manifestations come and go. The laws of nature continue to operate whether or not we observe their effects. The Logos structures reality whether or not anyone recognizes it. Understanding requires learning to perceive these hidden patterns through their visible effects. Heraclitus illustrated this principle with various examples. The harmony of the bow and lyre depends on tensions and forces that are not themselves visible, but only inferred from the instrument's behavior. The identity of the river depends on patterns of flow that cannot be perceived at any single moment, but only through observing change over time. The wisdom of the soul depends on rational structures that cannot be directly introspected, but only inferred from patterns of thought and action. This emphasis on hidden harmony led Heraclitus to be suspicious of the testimony of the senses. Eyes and ears are poor witnesses for people with barbarian souls. Our senses provide raw data, but understanding requires interpretation. The visible surface of things can mislead us if we do not learn to see through it to underlying patterns. Wisdom consists not in accumulating sensory information, but in developing the capacity to recognize hidden structures. Yet Heraclitus did not advocate ignoring sensory experience in favor of pure reason or mystical intuition. The hidden harmony can only be discovered through careful attention to how things actually behave. We must observe rivers to understand principles of flow. We must study living things to grasp biological patterns. We must examine our own thinking to understand rational structures. The invisible is known through the visible, but it is not identical to the visible. This creates a kind of paradox at the heart of knowledge. We must look at what is visible and apparent in order to perceive what is invisible and hidden. We must attend to particular instances to grasp universal patterns. We must study changing phenomena to understand unchanging principles. The path to the invisible goes through the visible. There is no shortcut that bypasses experience and observation. The invisible harmony also explains why reality contains both unity and multiplicity, both stability and change. At the visible level, we see countless different things constantly changing. At the invisible level, we see universal patterns that remain constant, even as their manifestations transform. The multiplicity of the visible world and the unity of the invisible logos are not contradictory, but complementary aspects of a single reality viewed from different perspectives. Heraclitus expressed this with another enigmatic fragment. The road up and the road down are one and the same. From one perspective, there are two different roads leading in opposite directions. From another perspective, there is only one road that can be travelled in either direction. Both perspectives are true, but they reveal different aspects of the same situation. Similarly, the many and the one are both true perspectives on reality. The challenge is learning to see how they relate. The concept of hidden harmony also has ethical implications. The truly good and wise person is not necessarily someone who displays obvious virtue or who is recognized and celebrated by others. Hidden virtue may be stronger and more genuine than visible displays. Someone might perform good actions for show while harboring selfish motives. Someone else might act rightly without seeking recognition or reward. The invisible harmony of genuine virtue is stronger than the visible harmony of performed virtue. This suggests that ethical judgment requires looking beneath surface appearances to underlying patterns of character and motivation. We cannot judge people reliably by their visible actions alone, but must try to understand the invisible structures that generate those actions. This is difficult and uncertain, which is why Heraclitus emphasizes the rarity of genuine wisdom. Most people judge by appearances and miss the hidden reality. The invisible harmony is also what makes teaching and learning difficult. The most important truths cannot be directly communicated, but must be discovered by each person for themselves. A teacher can point toward the invisible patterns but cannot make students see them. Understanding requires active effort and personal transformation. This is why Heraclitus writes in riddles and paradoxes. He is trying to provoke the kind of active thinking that can lead to genuine insight rather than merely transferring information. Part 11. Legacy and Influence. Heraclitus died around 475 BCE, probably in his early 60s, having spent most of his life in philosophical isolation in Ephesus. Ancient sources report that he developed dropsy, swelling due to fluid retention, and treated himself unsuccessfully by covering his body in cow dung and lying in the sun, hoping to evaporate the excess moisture. Whether this account is true or merely legend designed to make Heraclitus appear eccentric and isolated, we cannot know. But it symbolizes something important about his relationship to the world. He lived and died on his own terms, following his own understanding rather than conventional wisdom. His immediate influence was limited. Unlike Pythagoras or Socrates, he did not found a school or gather disciples. His writings were notoriously difficult, and most readers struggled to understand them. Plato and Aristotle both studied his work carefully but also criticized it harshly. Plato thought Heraclitus's doctrine of universal flux made knowledge impossible and needed to be corrected by positing eternal, unchanging forms. Aristotle accused Heraclitus of violating the law of non-contradiction and treating mutually exclusive propositions as simultaneously true. Yet, despite these criticisms, or perhaps because of them, Heraclitus's ideas continued to fascinate and influence philosophers throughout antiquity. The Stoics, particularly Chrysippus, incorporated Heraclitean themes into their philosophy. They adopted his image of cosmic fire, his emphasis on the logos as rational principle structuring reality, and his understanding of virtue as living in accordance with nature. They transformed these ideas into a comprehensive ethical system that emphasized accepting necessity and fulfilling one's role in the cosmic order. The skeptics used Heraclitus's paradoxes and his doctrine of the unity of opposites to argue that rational certainty is impossible. If the same thing can truly be both X and not X, then reason cannot provide secure foundations for knowledge. This was probably a misuse of Heraclitus's ideas, since he believed that the logos could be understood, even though it required unconventional thinking. But the skeptic's appropriation kept his name and some of his ideas in circulation. Neoplatonic philosophers like Plotinus saw in Heraclitus a precursor to their own understanding of reality as emanating from a single source through various levels of manifestation. The invisible harmony and the emphasis on hidden patterns appealed to their mystical inclinations. They interpreted Heraclitus as teaching about the one that lies beyond all multiplicity, though this is probably not what he actually meant. In the Christian era, Heraclitus's concept of the logos was appropriated and transformed. The Gospel of John begins, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The Greek term translated as word is logos. Early Christian theologians saw Jesus as the incarnation of the cosmic logos that Heraclitus had described. This appropriation radically transformed the meaning of logos from rational principle to divine person, but it also ensured that Heraclitus's name remained known throughout the Christian Middle Ages. The modern rediscovery of Heraclitus began in the 19th century with Hegel's dialectical philosophy. Hegel saw in Heraclitus a precursor to his own ideas about contradiction and development through opposition. Hegel's formula of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is clearly indebted to Heraclitean insights about how opposites generate new forms through their conflict. Though Hegel's system is far more elaborate than anything Heraclitus contemplated, the underlying inspiration is unmistakable. Nietzsche was even more enthusiastic about Heraclitus, calling him a kindred spirit and praising his insights about becoming and the unity of opposites. Nietzsche saw in Heraclitus someone who had grasped fundamental truths about reality that most philosophers tried to avoid. The emphasis on conflict, change, and the illusory nature of stable being all appealed to Nietzsche's own philosophical project. He claimed that Heraclitus would remain eternally right in teaching that being is an empty fiction. The 20th century saw renewed philosophical interest in Heraclitus from multiple directions. Process philosophers like Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Hartshorne explicitly drew on Heraclitean themes in developing metaphysical systems based on becoming rather than being, on events rather than substances, on relations rather than things. Though their systems are far more complex than Heraclitus's fragments, the underlying inspiration is clear. Martin Heidegger devoted considerable attention to Heraclitus, seeing in his fragments attempts to think being in its original, pre-metaphysical character. Heidegger believed that Heraclitus and other pre-Socratic thinkers had access to insights about the nature of being that were later covered over by the Western metaphysical tradition. Whether this reading is accurate is debatable, but it testifies to the continuing power of Heraclitus's thought to provoke philosophical reflection. Karl Popper saw in Heraclitus the origins of an open, critical approach to philosophy and science. Heraclitus's willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and his emphasis on discovering truth through inquiry rather than accepting tradition anticipated the scientific method. Though Popper was critical of various aspects of Heraclitus's thought, he recognized him as an important figure in the development of rational, critical thinking. Contemporary philosophy of science has found Heraclitean ideas surprisingly relevant. The emphasis on process over substance resonates with quantum mechanics, which describes reality in terms of fields and interactions rather than solid particles. The recognition that observation always involves interpretation connects to debates about theory-ladenness of observation in philosophy of science. The understanding that opposites can be complementary perspectives on the same reality parallels the wave-particle duality in quantum mechanics. Ecological thinking has also rediscovered Heraclitus. The understanding that everything is connected to everything else through relations of exchange and transformation, that stability emerges from dynamic balance rather than static permanence, that disturbing one part of a system affects the whole. All echo Heraclitean insights. Modern ecology is essentially Heraclitean, in recognizing that nature consists of processes and relationships rather than of isolated things. The contemporary understanding of complex adaptive systems in physics, biology, and social sciences is deeply Heraclitean. These systems maintain their structure through constant exchange with their environment. They exhibit stability that emerges from dynamic balance of opposing forces. They transform through time while maintaining identity through continuity of pattern. They cannot be understood by analyzing their components in isolation, but only by studying the relationships and processes that connect those components. Yet Heraclitus remains challenging and alien to contemporary sensibilities in important ways. His elitism and contempt for democracy conflict with modern egalitarian values. His pessimism about human nature and human possibilities seems harsh. His resignation to necessity and fate conflicts with modern emphasis on human agency and social progress. His philosophy offers no program for social reform or individual salvation. It provides understanding but not comfort, insight but not hope. Perhaps this is precisely why Heraclitus remains valuable. In an age of comfortable illusions and easy optimism, his harsh realism about human limitations and cosmic indifference provides necessary correctives. In an era of ideological certainty and political polarization, his emphasis on unity of opposites and the limitations of any single perspective offers important wisdom. In a time of rapid technological change and environmental crisis, his understanding of natural patterns and limits provides guidance. Part 12. Heraclitus for the 21st century. We live in an age that Heraclitus would recognize as exemplifying his core insights. Technology transforms our world so rapidly that skills and knowledge become obsolete within years. Social media creates constant streams of information and opinion that flow like rivers, never the same from moment to moment. Political movements rise and fall with bewildering speed. Environmental changes accelerate beyond our capacity to adapt. Everything solid melts into air, as Marx would later put it, echoing Heraclitean themes. We live in permanent revolution where stability itself seems like a nostalgic illusion. This contemporary experience of constant change makes Heraclitus more relevant than ever. His philosophy was designed precisely for people living in worlds where old certainties dissolve and new forms constantly emerge. He teaches us not how to escape from flux into permanent stability, but how to live well within conditions of constant transformation. He shows us how to find meaning and purpose without requiring eternal foundations or ultimate answers. The digital age particularly exemplifies Heraclitean principles. Information flows constantly through networks that connect everything to everything else. No single piece of information remains unchanged or uncontested for long. Multiple perspectives on every topic compete for attention, and none can claim absolute authority. Truth itself seems to have become fluid and relative, though Heraclitus would insist that beneath the flux of opinion, the logos remains constant. Social media creates what we might call Heraclitean rivers of discourse. You scroll through a feed and see opinions, images, and information flowing past. Refresh the feed, and everything has changed. The same platform is never the same platform twice. Yet patterns repeat. The same controversies recur in new forms. The same dynamics of outrage and solidarity play out again and again. Understanding social media requires recognizing both the constant flux and the underlying patterns, both the novelty and the repetition. Climate change and environmental crisis also vindicate Heraclitean insights. We are learning, painfully, that everything is connected to everything else through relations of exchange and transformation. Disturbing one part of the global ecosystem affects all other parts in ways we cannot fully predict or control. The stability we took for granted was always a dynamic equilibrium that required constant maintenance. Push the system too far out of balance, and it transforms into new configurations that may not support human flourishing. The pandemic of 2020 to 2021 provided a vivid demonstration of Heraclitean principles. A microscopic virus spread through global networks, transforming social, economic, and political systems in ways no one anticipated. What seemed solid and permanent, offices, schools, restaurants, theatres, suddenly became optional or obsolete. New forms of organisation and interaction emerged almost overnight. The crisis revealed both our vulnerability to disruption and our capacity to adapt to new circumstances. Artificial intelligence and machine learning embody Heraclitean insights about pattern recognition and hidden harmony. These technologies work by detecting patterns in vast amounts of data, patterns that remain invisible to human perception. They reveal that much of what we call intelligence consists in recognizing regularities beneath surface variation. They demonstrate that invisible harmonies, statistical patterns, and correlations can be more powerful than visible rules and explicit knowledge. The nature of identity in the digital age also raises Heraclitean questions. We maintain multiple online personas across different platforms. We constantly update our profiles and presentations. The self becomes something we perform and modify rather than a stable essence we possess. Yet somehow we remain recognizably ourselves, even as we constantly change. Identity consists in continuity of pattern rather than persistence of substance, exactly as Heraclitus suggested. Political polarization and conflict likewise exemplify Heraclitean insights about the unity of opposites. Each political faction defines itself against its opposition. Remove the opposition and the faction loses its identity and coherence. The conflict between groups creates the energy and passion that drives political engagement. The challenge is maintaining this creative tension without letting it escalate into destructive violence. We need the strife that Heraclitus called justice, without the war that destroys both sides. The contemporary crisis of truth and knowledge also requires Heraclitean thinking. We are flooded with information but struggle to achieve understanding. We have access to countless opinions but difficulty recognizing genuine wisdom. The problem is not lack of data but inability to perceive patterns, to distinguish signal from noise, to recognize the logos beneath the chaos of competing claims. Heraclitus would not be surprised that most people live as if asleep, consuming information without genuine comprehension. Yet Heraclitus also offers resources for responding to contemporary challenges. His emphasis on the logos, the rational structure that remains constant beneath flux, suggests that objective truth remains possible even in an age of relativism and information overload. Truth may be difficult to access and easy to obscure, but it exists independently of opinion and propaganda. Nature loves to hide, but it can be discovered by those willing to make the effort. His understanding of opposites as unified and interdependent provides guidance for navigating political and social conflict. We need not eliminate opposition, but must prevent it from becoming destructive. We should seek dynamic balance rather than total victory. We must recognize that opposing perspectives often reveal different aspects of complex realities, rather than simple truth versus falsehood. Wisdom requires integrating multiple perspectives, rather than choosing one and rejecting all others. His acceptance of change and transformation as fundamental provides psychological resources for living through times of rapid disruption. We need not mourn the loss of stability or yearn for permanent foundations. We can embrace flux while recognizing its patterns, accept change while understanding its principles, live fully in the present while recognizing our participation in processes that transcend individual experience. His emphasis on self-knowledge and personal effort in achieving understanding provides guidance for education and intellectual life. We cannot rely on authorities or experts to provide ready-made answers. We must think for ourselves, observe carefully, and work to perceive patterns that remain hidden from casual attention. Understanding is not a commodity that can be purchased or transferred, but an achievement that requires sustained personal effort. His naturalistic metaphysics provides an alternative to both religious dogmatism and nihilistic despair. We need not appeal to supernatural authorities to find meaning and value. We need not sink into despair about the absence of cosmic purpose. We can find sufficient meaning in the patterns and processes of the natural world itself, in our participation in life and consciousness, in the projects and relationships we create within our limited time. The path forward in the 21st century requires exactly the kind of thinking Heraclitus exemplified, accepting change while recognizing patterns, embracing multiplicity while perceiving unity, maintaining critical independence while acknowledging inescapable dependencies, living fully in the present while understanding its connections to past and future. These are not easy tasks, but they are necessary ones for any age characterized by rapid transformation and fundamental uncertainty. Conclusion. The eternal relevance of fire. Heraclitus stands at the beginning of Western philosophy as one of its most radical and original thinkers. 2,500 years after his death, his insights remain fresh and challenging. This is not because he solved philosophical problems that later thinkers simply forgot. Rather, he identified fundamental features of reality and human experience that every age must grapple with in its own way. Change, conflict, the unity of opposites, the gap between appearance and reality, the difficulty of achieving genuine understanding. These are permanent conditions of human existence that require ongoing philosophical attention. What makes Heraclitus eternally relevant is his refusal to offer easy answers or comfortable illusions. He looked directly at the most challenging aspects of existence and refused to explain them away or pretend they did not exist. Everything changes. Opposites interpenetrate. Stability is temporary. Knowledge is difficult. Most people fail to understand. Death is final. These are harsh truths, but they are truths. Any philosophy that denies them is building on foundations that cannot support weight. Yet Heraclitus also shows us that accepting these harsh truths need not lead to despair or nihilism. There is meaning and value available to beings like us in circumstances like ours. The patterns are real even if temporary. The logos exists even if most people fail to recognize it. Wisdom is possible even if rare. Life can be lived well even though it ends in death. We can create harmony through balanced tension, find stability in dynamic process, achieve understanding through sustained effort. The image of fire remains his most powerful symbol. Fire is pure process, pure transformation, pure becoming. It exists only in the act of burning, only as one form transforms into another. Yet fire has patterns. It burns according to principles that can be understood. It provides light and warmth. It makes cooking and metallurgy possible. It is both dangerous and beneficial, both destructive and creative. It must be fed or it dies. It spreads if not controlled. It responds to its fuel and environment. We are like fire. Consciousness is a flame that burns briefly in the darkness. It transforms matter and energy into awareness and activity. It must be constantly maintained, or it goes out. It provides illumination for those who tend it carefully. It can spread and influence others. It participates in patterns and processes that extend far beyond individual awareness. When it is extinguished, its components return to the cosmic circulation to fuel new flames. This is not a depressing vision, but a realistic one. It asks us to accept what we are and live accordingly. It frees us from the burden of having to be more than we can be, of having to achieve impossible permanence or cosmic significance. It allows us to appreciate the extraordinary fact that we exist at all, that the universe has produced beings capable of understanding their own temporary existence, that consciousness has emerged from unconscious matter and energy. Heraclitus teaches us to live as participants in cosmic processes, rather than as separate individuals seeking private salvation. We are not outside nature looking in, but inside nature looking around. We are not masters who control reality, but expressions of reality exploring itself. Our questions are the universe asking about itself. Our understanding is the universe understanding itself. Our creativity is the universe creating new forms. This understanding dissolves the boundary between self and world, between human and nature, between subject and object. We are not alien intruders in an indifferent cosmos, but natural products of cosmic evolution. Our consciousness, our rationality, our creativity are not supernatural gifts, but natural capacities that emerge through billions of years of transformation. The logos we seek to understand is not separate from us, but constitutes us. We are the universe becoming conscious of itself. Living according to this understanding requires courage to face hard truths, discipline to maintain focus and effort, wisdom to discern patterns, and humility to accept limitations. It offers no ultimate consolations or final solutions. But it does offer something valuable, the possibility of living with complete honesty and integrity, without illusions or false hopes, in full acceptance of what we are and the circumstances we face. The river still flows. The fire still burns. Everything continues to change according to patterns that remain constant. the Logos still structures reality whether or not we recognize it. Opposites still unite and transform into each other. The hidden harmony remains stronger than the visible. These truths that Heraclitus perceived in ancient Ephesus remain true in our contemporary world. They will remain true for as long as there are conscious beings capable of perceiving them. In the end, Heraclitus offers us not a system of doctrines to believe, but a way of seeing to practice. He teaches us to look beneath surfaces to patterns, to recognize connections where others see only separations, to accept change while understanding its principles, to find unity in multiplicity and multiplicity in unity. He shows us how to think for ourselves, rather than accepting conventional wisdom, how to question assumptions rather than living by unexamined beliefs, how to seek truth even when it contradicts our preferences. This is wisdom that every generation must rediscover for itself. We cannot inherit it ready-made from our predecessors, but must achieve it through our own efforts. Each person must learn to perceive the Logos in their own experience. Each age must learn to recognize eternal patterns in its own temporary circumstances. This is difficult work that most people never complete. But for those willing to make the effort, Heraclitus remains an invaluable guide. The eternal fire burns on. We are its temporary flames, burning briefly but intensely, providing light for ourselves and others before returning to the cosmic circulation. This is enough. This must be enough. This is what it means to be human in a world of constant transformation. Heraclitus understood this 2,500 years ago. We are still learning what he tried to teach,